They say when the wind cuts across Stillwater Lake at night, you can hear the bell of the old church, ringing from beneath the surface. But that's impossible, because the town it belonged to hasn't existed in over a century. In 1883, a small Montana settlement was swallowed by its own creation. A dam built to bring prosperity but instead delivered ruin. What happened in those final days before the flood remains one of the most haunting mysteries in the American frontier, because the town didn't just drown. Its people vanished. The founding of Clearwater began with a dream, one that shimmered like silver dust in the hands of desperate men. In the early winter of 1876, a group of settlers led by a former Union scout named Thomas Alcott stumbled upon a narrow Montana valley, flanked by snow-bitten ridges and shadowed forests. The land seemed cursed to most, too cold for crops, too isolated for trade. But Alcott saw promise in the gray stone that lined the nearby river. It glittered faintly in the sunlight, and when broken apart, it revealed streaks of something metallic. Within weeks, the rumor had spread. Silver had been found in Clearwater Valley. By spring, wagons rolled in from every direction. Miners, traders, families, preachers, drifters. They built their homes from rough-cut pine and their hopes on a fragile belief that the mountain would keep giving. The first shafts dug into the hillside were shallow and crude, yet the ore that emerged was unusually pure. Within a year, Clearwater was no longer a camp but a thriving town, boasting 2 saloons, a post office, and a single dirt road that led straight to the river. But from the beginning, something about Clearwater felt unnatural. The water ran colder than expected. Its surface often shrouded in mist even on warm mornings. Horses refused to drink from certain bends, and miners complained of whispers in the tunnels, soft voices echoing from rock that should have been silent. Some said it was the wind. Others weren't so sure. The town's prosperity seemed almost too quick, its wealth too sudden. Miners who had nothing but debt a year prior now wore fine coats and gold pocket watches. Yet there was no record of shipments leaving the valley, no evidence that the mines had produced enough silver to justify the riches. Local legend later suggested that Clearwater's true fortune came from something buried long before the settlers arrived, something they had awakened without meaning to. Despite its success, Clearwater had no official map, no government oversight. Everything ran through Elias Rowe, a man who arrived in 1878 claiming to be a surveyor and engineer from Chicago. He purchased large portions of land near the river and quietly took control of the mine's operations. To outsiders, he appeared charming, intelligent, generous even, but to those who worked beneath him, he inspired unease. Miners spoke of how Rowe would wander the tunnels at night with a lantern, tracing his hands along the stone and muttering to himself. He recorded strange symbols in a black leather journal, and when questioned, he said they were measurements for future expansion. Still, a few of the older miners refused to work under him after one particular incident. A cave-in that killed 3 men but left Rowe untouched, standing at the mouth of the shaft with dust on his coat, and an expression that one witness described as almost relieved. By 1880, Clearwater's boom began to wane. The mines yielded less silver, and the river began to flood its banks each spring, eroding farmland and threatening the town's lower edge. That's when Rowe proposed the idea of a dam, a structure that would control the water and provide energy for mills, promising to turn Clearwater into the heart of Montana's next great industrial rise. Many agreed. Others saw it as an act of arrogance, a way of defying the very landscape that had given them everything. Even in its height, Clearwater carried an uneasiness that no prosperity could erase. The nights were too quiet, the stars too dim. Newcomers often spoke of hearing what sounded like a church bell, though the town's church hadn't yet been built. A few even claimed to see light moving beneath the river, slow and pulsing like something alive. But Clearwater's people, hardened by survival, ignored such things. They believed in silver, not spirits. In men like Rowe, not the warnings whispered by the wind. And so they kept digging, kept building, unaware that the same river which had nourished their dreams would one day rise up to bury them all. When Jonathan Pike arrived in Clearwater in the spring of 1882, he was just another stranger passing through a restless town. He carried little more than a weather-beaten satchel, a pocket compass, and a folded letter from the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, commissioning him to survey the valley for a potential railway line. To most, he was just another government man, an outsider with sharp eyes and sharper questions. But to those who met him, there was something about Pike that lingered, an air of suspicion, as if he already knew something about Clearwater before he'd even set foot there. Pike was a quiet man, the kind who listened more than he spoke. Locals recalled how he often stood by the riverbank at dawn, sketching in a small leather-bound notebook, noting elevations, slopes, and depths. He had the look of a man haunted by detail, someone who noticed things others missed. It didn't take him long to realize that Clearwater was not the simple mining town it pretended to be. From the first day, Pike noticed that the town's maps didn't match the terrain. When he compared his measurements to the records provided by Elias Rowe, the engineer overseeing the dam project, he found inconsistencies, distances that didn't align, river depths that fluctuated in impossible ways. The earth beneath Clearwater seemed to shift from week to week, as though something underneath was moving. When Pike mentioned it to Rowe over dinner one evening, Rowe smiled in that slow, measured way of his and said, "The land remembers what it once was. It just takes time to settle." Pike wasn't convinced. He'd surveyed dozens of towns before, from Dakota to Oregon, and never seen terrain behave like this. He began to wander farther upriver, following the course toward the reservoir construction site. There he noticed the waterline rising unevenly, as if the ground itself were breathing. He also found old tools, rusted picks and lanterns buried deep in the mud, far older than the town itself. They bore markings he didn't recognize, carved not with words, but symbols, circular shapes intersected by lines like a language meant for the earth, not men. He brought one of these pieces to Clara Jensen, the schoolteacher known for her fascination with books and old texts. Together they tried to identify the markings, but found nothing resembling them in any written language. Clara later claimed Pike grew increasingly paranoid after that. He stopped sleeping, refused to eat meals at the saloon, and spoke in fragments about something alive beneath the river. At night, Pike stayed in his room above the general store, the lamp burning until dawn. The owner, Mrs. Weller, said she could hear him pacing, sometimes whispering under his breath. Then, on the morning of June 6, 1882, she found his room empty. His notebook lay open on the desk, filled with sketches of the dam site, except one page, where he had drawn the outline of Clearwater's valley, flooded completely, with a single word written beneath, "Return." Later that day, Pike's body was discovered behind the store, face down in the dirt. His lungs were full of water, though there had been no rain, no nearby pond, no footprints leading to or from the body. The coroner listed it as drowning, though everyone knew that made no sense. After his death, Rowe ordered Pike's belongings to be burned, calling him a troubled soul who lost his reason. But Clara Jensen, who had befriended Pike in his final weeks, quietly took one of his pages before the fire consumed it. It contained a set of coordinates, numbers leading to a point just below the dam's foundation. When she visited it days later, she found the ground there trembling ever so slightly, though the air was still. From that point onward, the construction crews refused to work past nightfall. They said they could hear hammering from below echoing up through the stones, steady, rhythmic, and not in any pattern made by man. Rowe dismissed the sounds, but others began to remember Pike's words, the warning he had murmured to Clara the evening before he died. "It's not the water we should fear. It's what the water is trying to hide." The dam rose slowly out of the valley like a scar, layer upon layer of stone and timber pressed against the restless current of the Clearwater River. When construction began in late 1882, most of the townspeople gathered to watch, their breath forming clouds in the cold autumn air. It was more than just a structure to them, it was hope. The silver mines were almost dry, the farm starving for steady irrigation, and people were leaving one wagon at a time. The dam, promised by Elias Rowe, was to be Clearwater's salvation, a monument to progress that would save the town from fading into the dust like so many others in Montana's forgotten hills. At first, it inspired pride. Men from the mines turned laborers overnight, hauling stone and timber from dawn till dusk. Rowe oversaw every aspect himself, moving along the scaffolding with his notebook tucked beneath his arm, muttering measurements and orders. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man building something grand. But those who worked closest to him said his precision bordered on obsession. He often changed plans without explanation, adding strange reinforcements to the lower levels and instructing workers to dig deeper into the riverbed than necessary. By November, they had uncovered something odd, a layer of ancient stone, smooth and flat unlike anything in the region. When one of the foremen, a man named Weller, mentioned it, Rowe told them to keep quiet and continue building. But that night, 2 laborers quit, claiming they'd seen light glowing beneath the water, moving like lanterns held by unseen hands. They said it wasn't the reflection of the moon, but something else, something coming from under the river itself. Despite the growing unease, the dam took shape. Clearwater's mayor declared it a triumph of man's will over nature, and for a brief time spirits lifted. The town hosted a celebration when the final cornerstone was laid that winter. But even as the crowd cheered, a few noticed the river's tone had changed. It no longer babbled or rushed. It hummed low and constant like a voice too deep to be human. By early 1883, things began to turn. The workers' health declined. Men complained of nausea and sleeplessness. Horses refused to approach the site. And each morning, fine cracks appeared in the lower sections of the wall. Cracks Rowe insisted were harmless, though they grew wider by the week. Clara Jensen, the schoolteacher who kept her journal faithfully, recorded that Rowe had started visiting the dam after midnight, alone, with only his lantern. She wrote of watching from a distance as he stood motionless atop the wall, staring into the water for hours as though waiting for something to surface. Rumors began to spread that Rowe wasn't merely building the dam to control the river, but to seal something beneath it. A few townsfolk whispered of Pike's death the previous year, how he'd been found drowned far from any water, and how his final notes mentioned returning tides beneath the earth. Clara found those same words scribbled into the margins of Rowe's own blueprints, phrases that had nothing to do with engineering. In March, one of the miners turned laborers, Samuel Corbett, went missing. His lantern was found half buried in the mud at the water's edge, still burning, though no sign of him ever surfaced. The next day, the dam's spillway jammed with debris and the current darkened, as though the river itself was grieving. Rowe ordered double shifts, claiming sabotage. He accused those who spoke of curses or ghosts of cowardice and fired them on the spot. Yet even he couldn't deny what came next. On the morning of April the 2nd, the sound of pounding woke the entire camp, heavy, rhythmic blows echoing from beneath the dam's base. The workers believed someone was trapped inside, but when they tried to find the source, the noise stopped. They lowered ropes into the inspection tunnels but found nothing. No man, no tools, only the echo of their own breath and the faint sound of water trickling where it shouldn't have been. After that, Rowe forbade anyone from entering the tunnels again. He claimed they were unstable, that the structure was settling naturally. But some swore they saw his lantern flickering inside those same tunnels at night. Clara's final entry that month captured the town's growing fear. The dam hums like a heartbeat now. Rowe says it's just the current pressing against the wall, but I've heard a heartbeat before, and this one sounds alive. By late spring of 1883, Clearwater was no longer the thriving town it had been. The dam loomed above it like a warning, a dark monolith of stone holding back a swollen, angry river. The townspeople had started to avoid it altogether. Children crossed the street to stay clear of the road that led to the reservoir, and even the workers who had built it now refused to go near. There was something unnatural about the water trapped behind the wall. It didn't move the way water should. On calm days, its surface remained perfectly still, mirroring the sky with an eerie clarity that made it difficult to tell where reflection ended and reality began. It was around this time that the first death occurred. A young woman named Margaret Weller, daughter of the general store owner, was found floating near the dam's base early one morning. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no torn clothing, just her body drifting gently against the stones, her eyes wide open as though she had seen something impossible before the end. Rowe ordered a quiet burial and forbade discussion of the incident, claiming she had slipped and drowned. But people whispered that Margaret had been seen walking toward the dam the night before, barefoot and silent, her face blank as if under some unseen spell. Within a week, more began to vanish. First, 2 miners who had returned to work on the lower tunnel system, then an old preacher who claimed that the water had A voice. He had been heard shouting scripture near the reservoir at dawn before disappearing entirely. Search parties found only his Bible, soaked and torn, resting on a rock with one passage still legible. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. The unease grew thicker by the day. The air near the dam carried a strange metallic scent, and locals reported hearing faint singing at night. Women's voices, layered and distant, coming from across the water. The sound would fade the moment anyone tried to follow it. Clara Jensen, who documented these events in her journal, described sleepless nights and a sense that the town itself was watching her. She wrote, "Every window feels like an eye. Every reflection a face waiting to surface." Elias Rowe became increasingly withdrawn. He stopped attending church, stopped eating with the other townsfolk, and was seen speaking to himself by the reservoir after midnight. Clara recorded one of their final conversations, recalling how his voice trembled with exhaustion when he confessed, "It's not the water that frightens me anymore, it's what it remembers." When she asked what he meant, he turned away and muttered, "It remembers every soul it's taken." Then, on May 18th, the reservoir turned black. Fishermen downstream were the first to notice. Fish floating belly up, their scales covered in a dark, oily residue that made the river glisten like liquid tar. The town doctor took samples and claimed the discoloration came from mineral runoff, but those who lived closest to the water insisted it smelled not of minerals, but of rot. A week later, heavy rains came. The dam groaned under the pressure, the sound echoing through the valley like distant thunder. Rowe assured everyone it was normal, that the structure was built to withstand storms. But that same night, several residents saw something terrifying. A faint glow beneath the lake spreading outward in circular ripples, as if candles were burning at the bottom of the water. Some said it was the reflection of lightning, but the glow appeared even when the sky was clear. The final warning came from Clara herself. In one of her last entries, she described visiting the dam at dusk and finding a row of footprints leading straight into the reservoir. They belonged to Samuel Corbett, the worker who had vanished weeks earlier. She followed them until they vanished beneath the water's surface. Nearby, embedded between two stones, she found something else, a silver locket containing a photograph of Margaret Weller. That night, the town bell rang 3 times without wind or hand to move it. By morning, the waterline had risen by nearly 2 feet, and the cracks in the dam's base had widened, bleeding streams of muddy water. Still, Rowe refused to evacuate Clearwater. He claimed that once the storm passed, everything would settle. But Clara's final words in her journal told another story entirely. There's no storm. The rain has stopped, yet the water keeps rising. It's as if something beneath is pushing to get out. June 14, 1883 began with the smell of rain and the sound of thunder rolling through the distant peaks. By midday, the sky above Clearwater had darkened into a dull greenish gray, and the air felt unnaturally heavy. The townsfolk shuttered their windows and brought their livestock up from the lowlands. But there was no real panic, at least not yet. Storms were common in those parts. What wasn't common was the deep rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come not from the clouds, but from the ground beneath their feet. Elias Rowe was seen pacing along the top of the dam that afternoon, coat-soaked, lantern swinging wildly in his hand. Witnesses said he kept looking toward the center of the reservoir, where faint ripples spread outward even though the rain had not yet begun. Clara Jensen, ever watchful, wrote in her journal that the sound of the water had changed again. It wasn't rushing or flowing anymore. It was breathing, like lungs filling too fast, she noted. By evening, the rain came in sheets, striking the roof of every house like hammers. The streets turned to rivers and the reservoir swelled to the brim. The men who had once worked on the dam gathered at the base, holding torches and shouting up to Rowe, demanding to know if it could hold. He shouted back that it could, that it must. But when lightning flashed across the valley, those below saw his face clearly for the first time in weeks. His expression wasn't confident. It was terrified. At midnight, a loud crack echoed through the valley. It wasn't thunder. The ground shook as part of the dam's lower wall split open, releasing a narrow jet of water that shot into the air like steam from a furnace. The men ran to fetch ropes and tools, but before they could reach the breach, the current tore through the gap, widening it with a roar. Within minutes, the entire central section collapsed. and the force of the released water ripped through the valley like a living thing. Fast, black and relentless. Houses were swept from their foundations. The church bell tower tilted and fell, ringing once as it disappeared beneath the surge. Clara tried to lead children from the schoolhouse up the hillside, but the flood overtook them before they reached the ridge. Survivors would later recall the sound, a deep guttural moan rising from the water as it swallowed the town whole. When dawn came, the valley was silent. Where Clearwater had stood the day before, there was now only a vast gray lake, smooth and perfectly still. Not a single roof beam or wagon wheel floated to the surface. Even the trees along the bank were gone, their roots torn out as if by invisible hands. Rescue parties arrived days later, but there were no bodies to recover. Dozens of families had vanished without a trace. Only a handful of survivors, those who had been far from town that night, lived to tell what they saw. One of them, a trapper named Isaac Bell, swore he'd seen lights under the water the morning after, the flickering glow of lamps moving slowly along what used to be Clearwater's main street. Like the town was still alive down there, he said, just carrying on beneath the surface. When the rains cleared, investigators came from Helena to assess the damage. They reported that the dam had failed due to structural weakness, but privately some whispered another theory, that it had been deliberately sabotaged. The explosion-like force of the break suggested dynamite. Others remembered seeing Rowe near the dam just before it collapsed and wondered if he'd intended it all along. No one ever found his body, though pieces of his coat were later recovered near the water's edge. Clara Jensen's journal washed up days later, sealed in a tin lunchbox. The last page was smudged with mud and water, but one line remained legible. He said it would hold. But when the ground shook, I saw him smile. After the flood, the government declared the area uninhabitable. The survivors left, the lake was renamed Stillwater, and the memory of Clearwater faded into folklore. But those who lost family there claimed that on quiet nights, when the moonlight hits the surface just right, the ripples form the shape of rooftops, and faintly from deep below, you can hear a bell tolling for a town that never had a chance to say goodbye. Years passed before anyone dared to speak openly about what lingered beneath Stillwater Lake. For decades after the flood, the valley lay silent, untouched and avoided, the waterline unchanged, its surface too still to seem natural. Locals said birds refused to land on it and that no fish ever broke the surface. Travelers on horseback often crossed the ridge above it, pausing to look down at what appeared to be a mirror set in stone. From afar, it looked peaceful, but at night, under a full moon, the calm shimmered with strange movement, ripples that came and went with no wind to cause them. The first to notice something truly unusual were loggers working in the forests above the valley. In the summer of 1897, one of them, a man named Emmett Shaw, camped near the lake's edge. He claimed that just before midnight, he woke to the sound of a bell ringing faintly through the fog. He thought it might be a cowbell from a stray herd, until he realized it was coming from beneath the water. The sound grew louder, steadier, until he could make out a second tone, a deeper, resonant hum, like the echo of a pipe organ under stone. He fled the next morning, refusing to return. Soon word spread that Stillwater was haunted. Families in nearby settlements said that when the wind carried right, they could hear singing drifting from the lake. Others claimed to see the glow of lanterns moving under the surface, shifting slowly in the darkness as though people still walked the streets of Clearwater. A traveling preacher even visited the site in 1902, declaring the waters a gateway to the unburied dead. He conducted a midnight sermon along the shore. By morning, he was gone, leaving behind his Bible floating face up in the shallows, the pages stiff with lake water. Fishermen refused to cast their lines there. Horses spooked when led too close. Some who camped nearby described waking to find footprints in the mud, bare human prints leading straight into the water but never coming out. No one could explain the phenomena, and few wanted to try. The area became known as the Drowned Valley, a place to pass quickly and never after sunset. Then came the divers. In 1931, a small team from Helena, led by engineer Robert Delaney, arrived to survey the lake for possible hydroelectric use. Delaney had heard the stories but dismissed them as backwoods superstition. Using primitive diving gear, the team descended into the dark, murky depths where Clearwater once stood. For the first 15 feet, visibility was almost non-existent. But as they went deeper, they began to see shapes, straight lines, shadows too organized to be natural. When their lamps finally pierced the gloom, they realized what they were seeing. Streets. Entire buildings stood eerily preserved, their outlines coated in silt, their windows still framed by rotting shutters. The deeper they went, the more the town revealed itself. An overturned wagon rested beside a fallen porch. A schoolhouse door hung by a single hinge. One diver swore he saw a woman's figure standing near the church steps, her hair drifting upward like smoke. But when he blinked, she was gone. When they reached the old church, the divers noticed the bell tower still intact. One of them tapped it with a crowbar, and to their horror it rang, muted and distant but undeniably clear, reverberating through the water. Beneath the steeple's archway, they found a small iron chest wedged against the doors. It was locked from the inside. They brought the chest to the surface, prying it open with rusted tools. Inside were waterlogged pages, what remained of Clara Jensen's journal sealed in wax and cloth. Though much of it was unreadable, a few lines survived, scrawled in trembling handwriting. The last entry was dated June 13, 1883, the night before the flood. Elias says the water is restless. He says it can't be contained, that it has a memory. He told me once that the dam was not to stop the river, but to hold something back. If he's right, it will not forgive us. After that discovery, Stillwater Lake was officially declared a historical site. But even decades later, hikers still report the same haunting details. Glowing lights beneath the water, faint bells ringing through fog, and ripples that move against the wind. Some say it's only the memory of a town lost to tragedy. Others believe Clearwater was never truly gone, that it simply sank beneath the surface, carrying its secrets into the deep, waiting for the day the water grows restless again. By the 1950s, Stillwater Lake had become more than just a local legend. It was an obsession for those who craved the strange and unexplained. The U.S. Geological Survey had mapped it, amateur historians had written about it, and a few daring souls had tried to drain parts of it, hoping to uncover what lay beneath. But the lake resisted every intrusion. Pumps broke without reason. Boats capsized in perfect weather, and every diver who went too deep returned shaken. Speaking of a pressure that wasn't physical but psychological, as if the water itself were aware of them. The last serious expedition came in 1957, led by a retired Navy officer named Harlan Pierce, who had spent his career studying underwater acoustics. He believed the so-called bell sounds that haunted the area could be explained scientifically, perhaps echoes from hidden caves or old mining tunnels. He arrived with state-of-the-art sonar equipment and a small crew, setting up camp near the northern ridge where the original Clearwater Church was believed to have stood. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. The sonar picked up the expected depth readings and silt formations, but no signs of solid structures. On the third day, however, a strange interference began. The sonar emitted rhythmic pulses that didn't match any known frequency. 3 short beeps, then 1 long, repeating every hour with perfect precision. Pierce initially dismissed it as a malfunction, but when they checked the recordings that night, the pattern had changed. The beeps had turned into something else, something faintly melodic, like a distorted hymn playing through layers of static. That same night, one of the crew, a young technician named Caleb Moore, disappeared. His tent was found zipped from the inside, his boots still beside the entrance, but his body was gone. Only his journal remained, water damaged though it hadn't rained. The last entry was just 1 sentence. "They're still down there, still singing." Pierce continued the investigation, desperate to find a rational cause. On the final night of the expedition, he decided to send a single camera drone into the lake, a military prototype capable of transmitting live footage from underwater. The feed showed little at first, endless black water, suspended debris, drifting vegetation. But then, as it neared the bottom, the camera caught something unmistakable. A row of windows still standing in perfect symmetry. Behind the glass, faint shapes moved like silhouettes shifting in candlelight. The transmission cut off abruptly. The last image saved was a single frame showing what appeared to be the church steeple, rising crookedly from the mud, a faint glimmer of light flickering beneath its archway. Pierce ordered the camp packed up by dawn and refused to speak publicly afterward. Within a year, he was dead from what doctors called sudden cardiac arrest. But those close to him said he'd stopped sleeping entirely in his final months, claiming he could still hear the sonar pattern. 3 short tones. 1 long, whispering through the radio static in his home. After that, the government quietly restricted access to Stillwater Lake, citing environmental hazards and unstable terrain. Local rumors suggested a deeper reason. Residents claimed that whenever construction crews tried to build near the waterline, machinery failed, foundations cracked, and strange electrical surges cut power. One worker reportedly said he saw a human figure beneath the waterline, pressing its hands against the ice during winter, eyes open and mouth moving as though speaking. By the 1970s, only a handful of people lived near Stillwater. The rest had moved away, leaving the valley eerily untouched. The old Clearwater town site, once just a story, became a point of academic curiosity. But for those who'd grown up nearby, it remained something else, a warning. On moonless nights, some still claimed to see a soft glow moving across the water's surface, pausing near where the church once stood. Others heard low rhythmic tones echoing through the fog. Scientists dismissed it as coincidence, an auditory illusion caused by shifting air pressure. But among the few who remembered the stories of 1883, those sounds were more than echoes. They were the voices of a town that refused to be forgotten. A reminder that Stillwater's silence wasn't peace at all, but memory preserved, alive beneath the surface, waiting to be heard again. What if the past never really sinks, it just waits beneath the surface? Stillwater may be silent now, but if you listen closely, you might still hear the bells. Maybe they're calling for someone to remember. Maybe they're warning us not to dig too deep. If this story pulled you under, subscribe to uncover the next one. Another forgotten chapter where history and horror intertwine. Tell us in the comments. What do you think lies beneath that lake? Was it tragedy or something darker still? Because in places like these, truth doesn't disappear. It just drowns and waits for someone brave enough to pull it back up.